Ooh, she's heard an eagle. It's probably not an eagle because we're in Worcester.
Westfield.
Today is the PS1's 25th birthday, at least if you're in Europe. And if you're watching this on the day the video's gone up, the 29th of September 2020. If only one of those things applies, oh, so close. If neither of those things apply, sorry? I don't know what you want from me. The PAL region, that's basically not the US or Japan in gaming terms, got itself a fair few exclusive PS1 games over those 25 years. Well, over about 10 or 11 years or so. But probably less than that actually, given how long the PS1 was relevant. Most of them were by Phoenix Games or Cryo Interactive, or were football games or Formula 1 or cricket, or French things like Hugo or Asterix. So really not worth talking about, let's be honest. There was also a batch of previous gen games ported to the then new gen and only released in PAL territories like these games. Blink and you will miss them. But I'm not going to talk about any of those. No, I'm going to talk about any of these. The hot tamales, the money makers, the golden tickets, the goose's ganders, the bogs's dollocks, the nifty nuisances, the thorough blemishes, the cardinal's cravings, the list of PS1 games that only came out in PAL regions and are worth a play. What I love about XCOM Terror from the Deep is that it was made in about 6 months because Microprose wanted a quick and cheap sequel, so what happened was the original game, XCOM Enemy Unknown, or UFO Enemy Unknown, or XCOM UFO Defense, or XCOM Unknown Invaders, depending on where you played it. That first game was reskinned, enemies were tweaked a bit, some new graphics were whipped up in no time, and soon enough you had yourself a full-blown sequel. Given it was exactly the same engine as the first game, it was guaranteed to be another strategy classic. What with the whole first game was a bona fide strategy classic thing going on. And still, they managed to mess it up by making it way too hard. Anyway, for some reason, Terror from the Deep only released in PAL regions on the PlayStation, so we didn't get an array of wild and wacky titles to refer to it as. I'll guess the US version would have been called XCOM Nuke the Sea, while the Japanese version would go with the title XCOM Underwater Force Strike First Go Go. But the real world never gave us the chance to see those titles become reality. A genuine shame, as Terror from the Deep, as daftly difficult as it is, and as lazy a sequel it might be, is a really good strategy game and worth a play on PS1, if only for the superbly unsettling music. Definitely not for the loading times though. Oh no siree. Of course, the best thing about Terror from the Deep was that you could cheat on it. Name your bases AEIOU and just like me, quit and restart, and you'll have a much less difficult time of it. Plus, it'll look like you really know what you're doing when you're playing the game to record a video of it. Ah, cheating back in the days when you didn't have to pay for the privilege. The third adventure game based on Terry Pratchett's peerless series of novels, Discworld Noir wasn't actually based on any of the novels. Still, it did see involvement from the late great Terry, but far less than in the previous two releases. Fortunately, the developers jumped on board with GT Interactive as publisher, with the company offering firm footing in the States to help promote and release the game in the US, something absolutely necessary given those last two games had done poorly in the land of the free. Then GT Interactive was absorbed into Infogrames before the release could be finalised, and it fell off the face of the earth. Oh. Anyway, Discworld Noir marked a big shift in the mood and presentation for the magical point-and-clickers, riffing on Raymond Chandler's world of PIs and dames with legs up to their armpits. It shouldn't have worked, because that's dumb to do in a world of magic, death, and cheap boots that don't last long enough, but yeah, it worked. Noir isn't a classic, and by crikey has it aged, those pre-rendered animations are painful at times. But it's a fine adventure game, it's well written and funny, and its relative scarcity makes it all the more fun an experience. Less War of the Worlds, more War of the One World versus a select few regions on another world. A less snappy title, but a more accurate one for sure. Yes, this nifty little take on the most terrifying story ever told, listen to Jeff Wayne's album and tell me otherwise, only made its way to those PAL nations on PlayStation, while the completely different game on PC made itself known indeed across the whole world of wars. And, would you believe it, that limited PS1 release was a shame. Of the World Wars was good. Clunky, awkward, lacking in solid feedback, too hard at times, decidedly silly at others, but definitely good. You would take on the role of fixed guns or a number of different vehicles, able to switch between them all at will, as you repelled Martian onslaughts across the United Kingdom. And when I say the United Kingdom, I mean England and Scotland, because sorry Wales and Northern Ireland, you're as forgotten in the game as you are by our government today. Eventually taking the fight to the Martians themselves, it was a fun but basic take on what could and should have been a straightforwardly shite licensed tie-in. I've just realised this was actually a licensed tie-in to a concept album, thus making it one of my favourite things ever. Dun dun dun. Wait, no, this one was shit. Moving on. Unlike most others on this list, Terracon was actually all set up for a release in the US. It was just cancelled for some reason or other. Midway obviously wanted to concentrate on, well, let's see what Midway released in Space Year 2000. Oh god, it was Mortal Kombat Special Forces. You poor Yanks. You could have had this fine little explory, puzzly shooter. Instead you got one of the worst games ever made. Priorities are weird. Terracon brought with it some genuinely impressive features on the piddlingly powered PlayStation. An open world, a small one you were free to explore, a day-night cycle, changing weather patterns, wildlife and early humans pottering about in your way. It was all there. Simplified, of its time, but there. And of course, the game proper, a third-person shooter at heart. It was a mix of fiddly 3D navigation and genuinely exciting combat, with a few puzzles thrown in for good measure. A real diamond in the rough. Well, a rough diamond in the rough. And definitely one for non-PAL players to check out, I'd say. A competent, uniquely presented sim/construction/management game that worked well on a pad and had a bit of a sense of humour and very 90s attitude about it. So why did Constructor need a re-release decades later to arrive outside of PAL territories on a PlayStation format? I'll go with because of how British it was, really. Full of the sorts of stereotypes you might not recognise if you're not from the shores of Blighty, I'd guess, and it is a complete guess, that the decision was made not to bring it out elsewhere just because the rest of the world would struggle to get it. Anyway, yeah, Constructor was a decent riff on the sim whatevers of the day, mixing in that sprinkle of mildly offensive stereotyping about the working classes alongside some less offensive stereotyping about land barons, because the latter are largely made up of subhuman scum. No, I don't see any hypocrisy in that statement, calm down. It was clumsy and lacked real depth, but more than made up for it with its idiosyncratic approach and twists on a usually po-faced formula. They need to re-release this via Pinball FX3, then I'll be happy. What's there to say? Worms Pinball was a competent Worms-flavoured reskin of an existing pinball game, Addiction Pinball. Everything was turning Wormsy around this period in history, so it made sense for any old nonsense to get the branding slapped on it and thrown out there. Why only in PAL regions? Probably just not worth the effort to pay money for packaging and distribution elsewhere, or something. So, a cash grab? Well, duh. But a solid 6 out of 10 cash grab. I just don't get why Bedlam or Bedlam only came out in PAL regions for PS1. It was so utterly perfect for other markets. Big robots zipping around, the Japanese market has a love for that. Ultra-violence for no real reason, you've got your Americans covered. Bits where there's not much happening and you feel a bit cold, Canadians sorted. But Bedlam was indeed PAL only on Sony's machine. It was a fun riff on the Syndicate or Future Cop LAPD style of things. An isometric top-downish viewpoint of a futuristic world where you skimmed around blasting enemies with overly high-powered weaponry, found switches, opened laser fences, and generally did that stuff you did on so very many games in the 1990s. Shallow it was, and loose it felt to play, but there's no denying the fun of pootling around at high speeds, twin-stick blasting mutant beasts in the bum. Technically, I said cricket games weren't worth talking about, what with them being in the list of the sorts of PAL-only games not worth talking about I mentioned earlier, but it's Brian Lara cricket, come on. A sport nowhere near as complex as people who've never played it seem to think it is, cricket is as boring as baseball but with comically large shin pads. Brian Lara, or Shane Warne in Australia cricket, was good. It was very of its time with canned motion captured animation and all that, and, keeping with the theme of not being overwhelmingly positive about almost all the games in this list, it wasn't as good as Graham Gooch World Class Cricket on the Amiga or the original Brian Lara on the Mega Drive. But hey, it was a lark. I totally understand it not making its way outside of the Pal Pals though. There was a time when it wasn't so straightforward to bring a game made for PC to console, with a keyboard and mouse focused one not able to translate successfully in many cases to a controller. Or joypad. I'll go with joypad. Pad of joy. This period was called pre-Halo and before devs stopped putting RTSs and Football Manager on console. It was a weird time. But in the 90s we had all manner of games that shouldn't have been on console, and one of these was KKND Krossfire, sequel to the original Crush, Kill and Destroy, and basically just an Australian rip-off of Command & Conquer. That's why this came to PS1, see? CNC had arrived a year or 3 previous and was actually half decent to play with a pad. Better with a mouse, but it worked on a controller. So it was that the RTS became more of a thing on console. Hey, check out my video I did about RTSs on SNES and Mega Drive. And, well, the broad appeal wasn't really there for Krossfire. It released in PAL territories, it wasn't as good as the PC version, but I tells you what, get used to those controls and actually it's a pretty fun game. Who'd have thunk it, eh? Let's ignore the fact I'd forgotten how to play Zed and failed at the very first mission when recording this, shall we? One of the last great hurrahs for the Bitmap brothers was Zed, and it is Zed because PAL only, none of this silly American alphabet noise. A real-time strategy title made with a simplified focus, it took the, focus away from resource management and instead, well, focused on smartly using your units to capture points around a map. It was better on PC, of that there's no doubt, but it was still a unique and fun little game for the PS1. An alternative to Command & Conquer and KKND, though perhaps not the world's greatest example of the genre. A follow-up to Virus, or Zarch, from the late 80s, V2000 did 2 things well. It updated a classic premise and brought it to a modern system impressively, and it did that thing loads of mid to late 90s projects did of adding 2000 to the title. Brilliant. The game itself was a technical marvel on PS1, an entire open world, as with Terracon a small one, but a worldy one, ready for you to quickly whiz about in and try and rescue idiot villagers from incoming ants and spiders and stuff. So, like a vehicle-based EDF then. It's absolutely worth playing for a few minutes at least, first just to see how surprisingly well it runs on the PlayStation, and B, because you'll only manage a couple of minutes before dying. Repeatedly. Star Fox, may as well call it Star Wing, this is a PAL-focused video after all. Star Wing was a great game, but you didn't actually see it copied all that much. Apart from by Space Debris, which I didn't even know existed till I looked into PAL-only PlayStation games. It's basically Star Wing, but on PS1, so that means better graphics and sound, and a frame rate that manages to be above 3 frames per day. Miracle. The game itself wasn't as good as Nintendo's classic, sure, but it is a fine curio and does stand out from the crowd. Well, it stands out to me, though probably just because it's in space and has explosions. This one released as Solar Eclipse on Sega's Saturn, so I'm assuming it was a quirk of international licensing that the game was allowed to be retitled and ported to PlayStation for a European release, avoiding the US and Japan. And honestly, I feel a bit sad if you missed out on it, because while Titan Wars might have been one of the most mid-90s things ever made, FMV sequences and sort of 3D but also 2D clunky graphics are all a big check, it was also a hell of a lot of fun. It was an on-rail shooter. Your ship flies in a defined path with some variation here and there. You could go left or right at certain points, basically. All the while, plenty of bad bastards flitted into view to be blasted, while the chatter from your squad in the bottom corner of the screen saw plenty of examples of some fine acting talent. It might well be laughable when you look at it with modern eyes, and when I first turned it on, honestly. But 5 minutes later you'd be hooked because it's a quick-paced shmup with a banging soundtrack and challenging design. Also, it had What's-Her-Face from Babylon 5 on it. Like I said, the most mid-90s thing ever. Probably the best game those outside of PAL regions never got, Wipeout 3 Special Edition was the culmination of the PS1 era of hover races from Psygnosis. While the vanilla 3rd edition did reach NTSC shores, this update wasn't just a basic do-over. As well as some tweaks to systems under the hood and tracks from the Japanese version of Wipeout 3 bundled in, the SE version also brought in tracks from previous Wipeout games. What that meant was you were able to play some of the first game's courses without endlessly losing because of the stupid way you'd hit a wall and come to a near stop in the original. Instead, I played Special Edition and just grazed walls and hit them but carried on a pace before finishing 4th a lot. The classic Wipeout games are, dare I say it, classics, and Wipeout 3 Special Edition is the best way to play any Wipeout from the PS1 era. And probably the PS2 era too, given that console didn't get anything particularly special for it in the Wipeout mold. The best PAL-only PS1 release? Maybe, yeah. Happy birthday, PlayStation. I'd have got you a cake, but you're a lump of plastic and metal and probably some rubber or silicone in parts, so that'd be a really stupid thing to do. Bye!